Okay, last week we talked about, the first part of the two classes that I want to do on the crash of 2008, and you heard a lot of the discussion about the University of Chicago School of Economics and how things were projected and really what was going on. It was a fairly sophisticated discussion of what goes on with investments. And so we hit the crash of 2008, and here to explain to you what happened is a CNBC reporter. Now, just keep in mind, this is someone who has a platform for communications with millions of people. So you would assume that he would bring to the party some context, some sensibility, something to make sense out of it all.
Is promoting bad behavior because we certainly don't want to put stimulus.
And on cable television, the talk had already begun of something they called a Tea Party.
The word Tea Party is born in a CNBC moment when Rick Santelli, a somewhat agitated, even under the best of circumstances, reporter for CNBC in Chicago, starts an uproar.
How about this, President and new administration? Why don't you put up a website to have people vote on the internet as a referendum to see if we really want to subsidize the losers' mortgages and reward people that could carry the water instead of drink the water?
Hey, Rick,
that's a novel idea.
Hey, Rick, did you?
What? Who thought of that?
They're like putty in your hands. Did you hear?
No, they're not, Joe. They're not like putty in our hands. This is America. How many of you people want to pay for your neighbor's mortgage that has an extra bathroom and can't pay their bills? Raise their hand. How about we all? President Obama, are you listening?
It was a moment that would become iconic. Digitized, uploaded, shared.
So the problem was that we had people who were buying homes that they couldn't afford, all of it on their own, because people had set up programs for them, and it had nothing to do with the fraud, that was perpetrated. The victims of the fraud are the problem, not the fraudsters. This is a guy who's supposed to know about finance. This is a guy who apparently doesn't know about a $27 trillion market that has no regulation. I just want to repeat that point from last week because it's important to understand it. This problem has been brewing since World War II and has its roots in Barbados in the 1600s, where they declared Protestant supremacy, no rules, no regulations. That whole concept was refined by the Mont Pelerin Institute and was championed by the University of Chicago professors like Milton Friedman. The idea of let the market rule led to a financial catastrophe that gave birth to Trumpism. This next clip that you're going to see is not about the crash of 2008. It's about the crash of 1998.
Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan told Congress today the U.S. economy is the best he's ever seen.
By spring of 1998, the idea of tougher regulation seemed out of step with all the good news.
Current economic performance is as impressive as any I have witnessed in my near half-century.
Those internet stocks continue their meteoric rise.
Investors are hoping Alan Greenspan will give them another boost by lowering interest rates yet again.
You have to remember the context. Companies are going public and doubling every week of the year.
If you thought the internet bubble was about to burst, think again.
Some weeks it was happening every day, and You know, the idea of worrying about derivatives was just, you know, so 20th century.
We were on a path towards, wow, markets can do great things. Communism was dead. Markets, capitalism was invincible.
But at Treasury, things were about to change. The carefully calibrated inner tranquility was being disturbed by a small tremor. It quickly made its way up to Robert Rubin. Brooksley Born was contemplating the regulation of OTC derivatives.
The pushback is visceral and immediate. And that's one of the striking things about this.
This was a job for Larry Summers.
I walk into Brooksley's office one day. The blood is drained from her face. She's hanging up the telephone. She says to me, "That was Larry Summers."
Larry basically reads her the riot act. He more or less tells her, my understanding is that you don't get it.
He says you're going to cause the worst financial crisis since the end of World War II, that he has, my memory is 13 bankers in his office who have informed him of this. Stop. Right away. No more.
In Washington, they say the financial sector has 5 lobbyists for every congressman.
Brooksley Born is stepping into the maw of the most well-oiled and highly financed lobby in the history of Washington, D.C. It's the financial lobby.
Bankers just fall over themselves, calling Summers and Rubin and Greenspan and everybody, saying, "Get this lady off our backs."
But the harder they pushed, the more interested Born became.
They were totally opposed to it. That puzzled me. You know, what was it that was in this market that had to be hidden? Why did it have to be a completely dark market? So it made me very suspicious and troubled.
Born's agency was legally independent. She reported to the president. Rubin had no authority over her. To stop her, he would call upon his allies who sat with him on a secretive council known as the President's Working Group.
The President's Working Group was the most influential White House body on financial policy.
It was called at the discretion of the Secretary of the Treasury.
It was a committee handpicked by Bob Rubin, and it was a committee that he steered.
Larry Summers attended, so did Alan Greenspan, and the chairman of the SEC, Arthur Levitt.
Alan and Bob and I had known one another and away from government. I think we all liked one another and respected one another.
By executive order, the head of the CFTC also attended the meetings.
I didn't know Brooksley Born. I was told that she was irascible, difficult, stubborn, unreasonable.
Rubin, Summers, and Greenspan had a great deal of faith in their own intellects. And I think that they were not welcoming of somebody who looked at the world different and was kind of abrasive.
You know, they were used to dealing mainly with men and with people they knew. And here was someone they didn't really know. They didn't know that much about her. And to boot, she was a woman. So, you know, put it all together and you got somebody that you can kind of flick off with the back of your hand. At least they thought.
As Rubin was quietly preparing the working group, Born was taking the first steps toward regulating OTC derivatives, designing a document known as a concept release. In response, Rubin acted, calling an emergency meeting of the working group.
We're driven there, and we get out at the entrance to the Treasury, go up to the room. Everybody assembles. The secretary walks in. The meeting is called to order. And the subject of the meeting was to discuss the concept release, and the clear mission of it was to convince Brooksley that it shouldn't be issued.
What's amazing is that Rubin and Greenspan said, no, you can't do that. We just can't have this. And it got pretty nasty pretty quickly.
Those on the other side were saying, look, this deregulated market is part of what's brought us the boom times. And so we don't want to change that. You know, the market will take care of everything. And we really don't need regulation of these. And in fact, it would be counterproductive.
Each of the principals in turn, that is to say, Rubin, Greenspan, and Levitt, take their shot at telling Brooksley that she shouldn't do what she's doing.
Rubin says to her, "You don't have the legal authority to do this."
And Brooksley said, "Oh, that's interesting. That's the first time I've ever heard that. All my lawyers at the CFTC have assured me that we have the exclusive jurisdiction to do this."
Rubin was condescending toward her. He said he would get his lawyer in the department to help her understand the laws better, something like that.
SEC Chairman Arthur Levitt had been personally lobbied to join the effort to shut Born down.
This tight-knit group persuaded me that we really would face a situation of financial turmoil if we tried to undo these existing contracts.
And then it was Alan Greenspan's turn.
I happened to be sitting behind Brooksley and behind Greenspan. They're sitting next to each other. Greenspan turns to her, she turns to him. His face is red, and he's clearly quite upset. He was very adamant that this was a serious, serious mistake, that it caused untold damages to the financial services market, and that she should stop and not do this, that it was unwise and would cause tremendous damage.
In a group of this kind, there will be a disparity in power, and it would take an extraordinarily outspoken, knowledgeable, pugnacious person to fight the losing battle against the titans who led that group.
It's the education of Brooksley Born. They decided that, hey, she's not playing ball. We're going to teach her a lesson. And we're going to get this thing killed because we don't want it to happen.
But 2 weeks later, Born told her staff to publish the concept release.
That creates an earthquake. You're talking foundation of the building. And she is literally in the crossfire of an amazing number of bullets.
The response of the working group was immediate and unprecedented.
By the afternoon, Rubin, Greenspan, Levitt put out a statement saying, this is a very bad thing, and Congress should act with all deliberate speed to block it.
We have grave concerns about this action and its possible consequences. We are prepared to pursue, as appropriate, legislation that would provide greater certainty concerning the legal status of OTC derivatives.
The powers that be in Washington put out the word to the media, and they put out the word to Capitol Hill that her views were not to be trusted, they were not to be taken seriously, that she was running a podunk agency. This was a power grab, and she didn't have a clear understanding of the products that she was going to regulate and shouldn't be entrusted with that kind of power. And it would be a great mistake if she were.
The hearing of the Senate Agriculture Committee is now called to order.
Only Congress had the legal authority to stop Born. Rubin, Greenspan, Summers, and Levitt lobbied hard.
Today we will receive testimony on over-the-counter derivatives.
Hearings were held almost immediately in both the House and the Senate.
Brooksley is a lady, and the men were gentlemen, but the feelings were quite intense. This was an enormous embarrassment to the executive branch because they couldn't coordinate with each other.
There are a ridiculous number of congressional hearings.
Essential that the government not create uncertainty.
CFTC wants to come into somebody else's yard here.
She just gets pummeled on Capitol Hill.
I see no evidence whatsoever to suggest that this is a troubled market, that fraud is rampant.
The release has cast the shadow of regulatory uncertainty over a thriving market.
The CFTC's action has and will bring, I believe, significant disruption to this important global market.
Serves no useful purpose, hinders the efficiency of markets to enlarge.
All the regulators there testifying, and all of them say this is a bad idea, this is a bad idea, this is a bad idea, this is a bad idea. And then she says this is a good idea, and the senators and congressmen just beat her over the head.
I feel very strongly that we should not have one agency innovate in this area, and in doing so create very substantial financial problems.
90% of the members of Congress couldn't have told you what a derivative was. So all they knew was that these guys on Wall Street, some of whom make big campaign contributions, many of whom seem very smart, say if we do this, it'll screw up the economy.
My question again is, what are you trying to protect?
We're trying to protect the money of the American public, which is at risk in these markets.
It's important to understand what we're arguing about here. It is a $17 trillion banking finance system with no regulations, no reporting, nothing. In my mind, it is the equivalent of saying, take down all the traffic lights, take the motor vehicle laws, throw them in the garbage, and everybody just get out there and do whatever the hell you want. We'll let the market rule. And so the power of markets will straighten it out. We've got 330 million people. Yeah, maybe some things will go wrong and we'll be down to 210 million people, but eventually they'll regulate themselves. And so this idea of no rules, no regulations, I feel it is imperative for you to understand that that is exactly what happened in the 1600s when the European invaders invaded Barbados, declared Protestant supremacy. We're not going to live under the rules and regulations of religion as it relates to slavery, as it was in the past. And this idea becomes eviscerated with the Great Depression of 1929 and is shown to be bankrupt. And we respond to it and we say, we're not going down that road again. And we put together a regime of rules and regulations that leads to the period of the greatest prosperity for all Americans. And the people who are threatened by that, are going to fight back. And it takes a long time. It's taken 60 years or however long it is, but they have now gotten to a position where they hold power over the country. And this is at the turn of Y2K. Now, what happens is, what could possibly go wrong with that? This, by the way, is a decade before the crash of 2008.
That summer of 1998, Bordan testified 4 times before hostile congressional committees.
They were hearing from very respectable sources that there was no problem, and they chose to rely on those people. And I think that was understandable. I think it was unfortunate, but I think it was very understandable.
I thank each one of you for coming and for your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The system wasn't set up to allow somebody like Brooksley Born to have a real impact.
She was running against the tide of very powerful forces and powerful forces that were doing exceptional.
I'm sorry to interrupt again, but I just have to say that the courage, the strength of Brooksley Born, the integrity of Brooksley Born, and you compare her to the kind of stuff that we're looking at today, People don't have the courage to simply say the election's over.
Well. As Congress headed for the summer recess, it seemed likely they would not heed Bourne's warning.
She had no support anywhere.
She wasn't a member. She had no political capital. She had no chance.
Then Bourne's warning became a prophecy.
I was at home and I got a call, and as I would often get a call from the Treasury operator. And it was Secretary Rubin on a Saturday, and the Secretary of the Treasury wants to have a conversation with me about this hedge fund that apparently was about to go under.
The hedge fund, long-term capital management, was melting down. A quiet panic had begun. It looked exactly like what Brooksley Born had been warning about. Known on the street as LTCM, it was the trillion-dollar favorite of in-the-know investors.
LTCM's a hedge fund. It's run by John Merriweather, ex-Salomon Brothers. He's considered one of the great geniuses of the bond market. Tons of money flows his way from private investors who would like to make a killing via his smarts.
The firm also had the former vice chairman of the Fed, Alan Greenspan's number 2.
David Mullins and John Merriweather operated LTCM outside government regulations.
They were the personification or the embodiment of Alan Greenspan's credo. Credo was, markets get it right.
LTCM invented complex mathematical formulas and used derivatives to place their bets.
These guys are the rock stars, the long-term capital management team. They're sort of rock stars for the math clubs of America.
LTCM is a case study in arrogance. A lot of really, really smart people who thought they had a foolproof money machine. A number of them Nobel Prize winners.
Neither the government nor investors knew anything about how LTCM worked. It was a completely secret process.
If you want to invest in long-term capital management, you've got to walk into a conference room, abandon computers, abandon pencils, abandon yellow pads, no notes, and you're told there's a black box. Look at these returns, 46%, 40%, 20%. People are fighting to get to invest. People are fighting to lend money.
LTCM did business with 15 of Wall Street's biggest banks, leveraging $5 billion into more than $1 trillion in derivatives.
All these big banks hadn't done their homework. They didn't even know the extent of LTCM's exposures in the market or the fact that all of the other OTC derivatives dealers had been lending to them as well.
Then, trouble. LTCM's complicated computer models were failing.
In Russia, the financial markets were hit hard today.
Rocked by a financial crisis in Russia.
The firm had all sorts of models that said no matter what happened, based on history, they couldn't lose more than $35 million a day.
In Russia today, a grave financial situation grew decidedly worse.
The effects of the Russia crisis were evident everywhere.
They started dropping $300, $400, $500 million every day.
Word of a pending collapse spread. Many banks had invested in LTCM's derivatives, believing they alone were in a deal. They weren't.
When LTCM started to get stressed, and these guys said, I want to collect my collateral, they all discovered that a lot of other parties had the same claims on it.
With Wall Street's banks in a panic, LTCM was perilously close to collapse. And that's when Washington first heard about the problem. The Secretary of the Treasury began to contact members of the President's Working Group.
I got a call from the Treasury Department. I thought that LTCM was exactly what I had been worried about. None of the regulators had known they were on the verge of collapse. Why? Because we didn't have any information about the market.
That weekend, the members of the working group were told the entire American economy was hanging in the balance.
Long-term capital management had very large positions in the over-the-counter derivatives marketplace. And if it came down, the question is, how would that affect the American public? How would that reverberate through the system and affect everybody's livelihood in the country?
The fear is that if it goes down, it would present what they call a systemic risk, something that could unwind the entire financial system.
At Treasury, all they could do was watch and wait.
It was very scary. Credit markets around the world just shut down. There was a period of real panic. People were very, very frightened. These firms were worried about, in some cases, their future, in some cases, their survival. It was a real bloodletting.
After 4 days, the Fed acted, but not directly. The Wall Street banks were pressured to bail out LTCM themselves.
The government said, it is our belief that your financial stability is in jeopardy. And the way to solve this problem is for you each to pony up $400 million and buy the fund, prevent it from collapsing, and try and work the thing out.
14 banks agreed to put up a few $100 million each, about $3.5 billion total.
It worked. The crisis passed. In Washington, a collective sigh of relief.
Yeah, it was a collective sigh of relief. But did they learn anything from it? Or did they continue on to hold on to the mantra, let the market rule? Now, mind you, what they're saying is the markets will get it right. But they had to intervene, and they had to force the banks to do stuff that was not letting the market figure it out. They were not going to let that happen, because if it did, all of the banks would crash. So they are contradicting their own theory, if you will. And then 10 years later,
foreclosures jumped a staggering 158%.
The market fell as if down a well.
Millions of jobless Americans are about to get kicked to the side of the road by corporate greed.
More and more homeowners in the crossfire.
People look upon Wall Street right now and they see record-breaking salaries. There's something wrong with this picture.
If you want to understand why this country is in the appalling shape that it's in, many people look to the richest 1%.
Anger at the U.S. financial sector boiling over on Wall Street.
The Koch brothers are the poster boys for the top 1%. Their money, their power, fuel the growing inequality in America.
The Koch brothers are among the most powerful of the moneyed elites that are knocking down the working class, knocking down the middle class, stomping on poor people.
The Koch family has been defining the lives of ordinary working Americans under the radar for more than 50 years.
They inherited their wealth and their penchant for secrecy from their father, Fred, who made his fortune in the oil business in the Soviet Union of the 1930s.
Stalin himself brought Fred Koch into the Soviet Union, building pipelines, teaching them how to be oil engineers. Fred Koch came back to the United States after taking money from the Soviet Union and used that money to start his own oil empire here, amassing some $200 million.
With his wealth and power, he began to wage a systematic attack on American values, including funding the John Birch Society. It's a far-right, racist organization that saw communist conspiracies everywhere. They even accused then-President Dwight Eisenhower of being a Soviet spy.
Fred Koch wrote screeds against the civil rights movement, saying that it was communist-driven and that white children should not go to school with black children, that it would lead to the mongrelization of the races. This is the climate that the two brothers, Charles and David, grew up in at home. And then they inherited a big pile of money from Daddy Fred, and then they put that into their own organization and helped build it up to where it is now, a $100 billion a year enterprise.
Koch Industries is the second largest privately held corporation in the country. They have holdings that range from oil and gas to paper products, forestry, consumer goods, plastics, and ranching. They have operations in 45 states. The most important thing is not that they have wealth, it's that they're using their wealth to run roughshod over the American people.
I get involved with the mothers demand action, and because, you know, it seems that when we have children slaughtered in their classrooms, we ought to do something about that. And one of the points that I made early in the class is that when you're up against some powerful force, you need to really understand who is your enemy. Because if you don't, you can wind up investing a lot of resources trying to solve the wrong problem, trying to counter the wrong force. And I'm very frustrated with the organization because they're organizing an event to go and demonstrate at the state capitol and to try to get one-on-one meetings with legislators, as if you have to convince somebody that killing children is bad. They already know that. They're fighting the wrong enemy. It was the Kochs and their gang that seized control over the NRA as part of a long-term strategy to drive wedges between Americans. They had to get something to break down Americans' love affair with their country and their government. It was but one tool of that. So if you want to go and fight that stuff, you don't demonstrate at the state capitol. Go to the Georgia Pacific building on Peachtree Street. It's owned by the Kochs. Put a spotlight on the people who are really behind these things. And I have to tell you, many, many, many times I found in my consulting world that people were spending a lot of money trying to solve a problem, but it was the wrong problem. And it was only through history you would learn what the problem really was.
The internet bubble.
Get to this.
Think about.
And so there was a problem.
3.5
They
years
had their
later.
theory.
Immediately after that.
It didn't work.
How does that make you feel?
Great.
Dr. Greenspan, your view of the world, your ideology was not right. It was not working.
Precisely. No, that's precisely the reason I was shocked, because I've been going for 40 years or more with very considerable evidence that it was working exceptionally well.
Greenspan had been working to the assumption that the financial system was a self-stabilizing system. It meant that he took a view of asset price bubbles, which was that it really wasn't in his remit to do anything about them. He had this idea that the central bank should never question asset prices. It should only take action when asset prices started to fall. So whenever there was the tiniest slowdown, he'd be leaping in with monetary stimulus, cutting interest rates and trying to boost activity again. And of course, boosting economic activity is just a euphemism for trying to encourage the economy to borrow even more. Creating a credit boom or a credit bubble. So we're in this crisis in large part because our central banks have, for the last 2 or 3 decades, encouraged us to borrow more and more and more, and eventually got us into this unsustainable state. Now, if the central bank's operating its interest rate policy in a way to encourage asset prices to keep inflating, obviously that's going to benefit that portion of society that owns assets, which is typically the wealthy end of the spectrum already.
In 1900, many men had to work 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, to earn enough money to provide their families with the bare essentials. Hand labor was the rule in the home as well as the factory. A half-century later, we had invested enough in our business system to provide the average worker with efficient and expensive buildings and machinery to enable him to produce enough in a 40-hour week to earn twice as much as the 1900 worker earned in a 60-hour week. This shorter work week gives us all more leisure time to enjoy a standard of living beyond the wildest dreams of anyone who lived a half-century ago. The more we earn, the more our families have to spend for the things they need and want.
You ask an American, when was America most prosperous in the 20th century? Most Americans, outside of financiers and Wall Street, will tell you the 1950s. It's thought of as this time of perfection, this golden age of capitalism with big fin cars and houses, and any guy could get a job and support his wife and kids. And this kind of lifestyle isn't possible for most people today.
And fortunately, we have been able to raise our standard of living without sacrificing the spiritual side of life, which means so much to the American family.
Now, this is also the moment in America that has the least income inequality in our history. And I don't think that's a coincidence. Before the sort of World War II period, income inequality was very high.
The share of total American income going to just the top 1% peaked in 1929 at about 22%, which is an extraordinary figure.
And then as you go into World War II, income inequality falls from 1945 to 1970.
In the 1970s, the top 1% were getting only 9%. That was a huge fall.
And then in the 1970s, you start to see it rise again, accelerating in the 1980s.
There's been a big shift in the way income growth has occurred in the United States, certainly, but also in other countries as well, though not to the same degree. What we've seen is that unlike the 3 decades right after World War II, when incomes grew at about the same rate for everyone, starting in the early 70s roughly, income growth started accumulating only at the top.
The share of the top 1% went shooting up like a July the 4th skyrocket, back up to about the same as in 1929.
And partly that can be explained by the credit boom or the credit bubble.
You were okay up to that credit business. Couldn't you make that a bit clearer?
To really understand it, you have to go back to the 1920s. There was increasing inequality, but there was also increasing debt.
The US was developing great productive capacity in consumer goods industries, such as refrigerators, such as radios, such as automobiles.
And these were very expensive for the average worker at the time.
And so over the mid-20s to late 20s, there's an incredible explosion of installment credit in America. People could borrow to pay for all the new modern electric appliances.
And you had a rapid rise in credit in the economy, to the point at which we got too much credit, too much indebtedness, and then eventually the system collapsed.
So the 1920s can actually be seen as a kind of precursor of what happened in the 2000s. So you have a very pronounced U-shaped curve, just as we have seen happening with income distribution.
And that's because economic activity, profit growth, and credit creation are all intimately linked.
Ah, yes, dear lady. High quality at a low price.
If the banks are more willing to lend, it becomes easier for companies or for households to spend, because they can borrow money and they can then spend it.
Sales dollars from satisfied customers once again flow back.
So as credit rises, corporate profits rise.
The remainder of the profit is paid out as dividends.
Well, who tends to own the shares in the corporates and the shares in the bank? Generally, it's the wealthier people that own the capital stock of an economy. So if profitability is being boosted, then there's a natural tendency to polarize wealth distribution within the economy as well. That's a symptom of a credit cycle.
Say, that sure was a neat job.
That building across is the most important building on Wall Street. That building is the House of Morgan building. That's where J.P. Morgan's original bank was.
The institutions that are going to make the most profit from that credit creation process are, of course, the banks. Every time a loan is made, they take a margin on it. Every time a bond is traded, they take a margin on that as well. So the credit bubble creates a system where you boost financial profitability more than profitability in the rest of the economy. So if there's a boost to profitability for the banking sector, it tends to drop quite quickly through to pay for bankers, through to bonuses.
Here we go.
I think the compensation strategy that we've had for many years is in line with best practices to encourage long-term incentives.
The closer you are to the money, the more of it you make.
If I took anybody and I paid them $10 million for their job, I took you and I started paying you $10 million for your job, in 2 weeks you will think you'll deserve it.
I'm looking forward to my next billion.
We want to hire and retain the smartest people in the world. And so we have to offer them incentives which can compete with those that are trying to attract the best and smartest people in the world too.
You know, we just want one thing from Wall Street. We'd like them to be able to do the math. That's all we want. We just want them to be able to do arithmetic. And they got it completely wrong.
If they were that good, we wouldn't have been in this mess.
All right, so our next stop is gonna be Deutsche Bank, where I used to work. All right, let's go.
So it's been an enormous pyramiding of income and wealth in the last 30 years. If you look at the people in the top decile, the lion's share of the growth that occurred there was in the top 1%. Slice that up and you'll see the lion's share of the growth in the top 1% occurring in the top 1/10 of 1%, and so on, as far as we've managed to go up and find data to check.
For everybody else, this new inequality meant a bunch of things.
Only a business operating at a steady profit can give its workers security and
From World War II until about 1970, wages grew very steadily. There was a widespread, well-paid manufacturing economy, good steel work, good car work.
high wages and steady employment.
All this changed after 1970, with the double whammies of the rise of globalization and deindustrialization beginning to hit the American workforce.
Through the 1950s, 60s, 70s, the bottom 90% of the American population was getting roughly 65% of national income. That share fell to about 50% in the last few years.
Adjusted for inflation, the median wages stagnated from the early 1970s, except for a small blip in the early 90s, till today.
It's a myth that people didn't see this crisis coming. There was a lot of chatter in the industry.
Despite the Dow hitting a 3-month high, more and more analysts are cautioning that a recession could be just around the corner.
Well, things started to go wrong in the fall of 2006.
In all these years that we've been running these trade deficits, the wealth of the average American household has been going up, not down.
The so-called smart money people, the definition of being a smart money kind of person or player is that you know when to get out. And so they all thought they knew when to get out.
Sophisticated investors would negotiate for better protections. They'd say, well, I need more protection against potential defaults in the portfolio. So they'd get an extra 1% protection. But 1% extra protection was like saying to somebody, I'm going to give you an extra life vest to wear on the Titanic.
When you see the stock market come down and the real estate bubble burst, all that phony wealth is going to evaporate. And all that's going to be left is all the debt.
My safety valve in my mind when I did this, again, no one put a gun to my head, but I always thought if the market starts to turn, I'll sell.
This is an economy that's driven by good economic policies, by good monetary policy, by good trade policy, and it's working beautifully.
You started having borrowers not paying in the first month, the second month, the third month, and this wave of mortgages coming back to the originators.
It's a zero-sum game. Every interest dollar paid is interest dollar earned.
The people that earn the dollars are in China.
What triggered it was an abrupt lowering of ratings on hundreds of subprime mortgage-backed securities.
And that struck a huge panic into the whole structured products market.
Investors suddenly knew that the game was up. It wasn't that they were surprised that the downgrades had happened, but they now knew that all of the other securities couldn't hold up either. And knowing that, they bailed out very, very quickly.
Oh yeah, we were surprised at how fast the devastation took place.
There was no time to sell. Once there's blood in the water, everybody's running, and there was just no way out.
The crisis came on us rather fast, and it took fast action. I think that the government had to prevent a collapse of confidence.
The whole system was predicated on there being a complete gap between the people on the ground making the loans and the people packaging them to sell them off as, through the securitization process on Wall Street. So that you can have people sitting in their high-rise building on Wall Street or wherever they were in their fancy offices, having no connection whatsoever and no regard, and not even in their imagination, thinking about what this commodity was that they were bundling and selling off. They were completely severed, and that was why this was able to go for so long, because one would hope there would be some people within that machinery that had some conscience, and that if they understood what they were packaging was actually translating very concretely into loans that were, let's just be blunt, ruining people's lives. I mean, wiping out people's life savings, stealing their equity, making people homeless, wrecking families. I mean, the devastation can't really be overstated what it means to sort of be kind of induced into a loan that then spins out of control and leaves you without your home.
Do I feel any responsibility?
I think responsibility is a difficult feeling for people in the sense that most people's participation, other than a select few, which had very, very important jobs, probably head of the rating agencies, some chief regulators, a couple chief bankers, et cetera. Most of the other participants in the system, I think, kind of felt like cogs in the wheel of a much larger piece of machinery.
Mr. Chairman, I know I agree with you in the fact that there were a lot of people who raised issues about problems emerging, but there are always a lot of people raising issues, and half the time they're wrong. And the question is, what do you do? I mean, you point out quite correctly that the Federal Reserve had as good an economic organization as exists, and I would say, in the world. If all those extraordinarily capable people were unable to foresee the development of this critical problem, I think we have to ask ourselves, why is that? And the answer is that we're not smart enough.
Okay, well, I wanted you to see those extended clips because I think, captures the enormity of what happened, that when people pretend like this came out of nowhere, they're not telling you the truth. They're not smart enough. Well, I mean, come on, Ellen. That there's going to be greed and it's going to fall apart and there's going to be fraud. That whole derivatives market was a playground for fraudulent activity, and to think that that wasn't going to happen is beyond naive. Okay, George, Lauren, we can open up.
Another happy day with Sal. I love it. So now I'm sure that you have questions and comments and other things for Sal. If you could use the raise the hand function, that'll help us sort people out. Or if you have something that you want to drop down into chat, we can do that as well. So everybody's sitting at their seats going, oh, sighing at this point. Really.
Well, no, this is it's a difficult topic, and
here we go.
Norm, go ahead.
I mentioned to you that this book and movie, The Big Short, people made a tremendous amount of money by betting against mortgage-backed securities, and realizing that it was fraudulent, that it was a paper house that was going to come down. And some people made a lot of money off it, and in a very cynical way, but they did. And it's and the book by Michael Lewis and the film and the movie based on that book is entertaining, and probably it really explains how capitalism works to some extent at the margins. And so my reaction to it is, where's the next Big Short?
Well, here's a thing that I think is important to recognize about the shorting that took place. And the derivatives market was a mechanism for shorting. Goldman Sachs would put together a security that's backed by mortgages. And they know that there's some good mortgages in there, and there are tranches of other mortgages that are junk. And they know that. So they're offering this bond that is, you invest $1,000 and 10 years from now, we'll give you your $1,000 and another 100. But they know that this thing that is backing the claim that they're going to get their money so they can, pay you back your $1,000 and give you 10% interest. They know that that's going to collapse because they know that they're junk mortgages. So what do? They earn their early money from the initial sale of the bond. Then they do a credit default swap. They go to AIG and they say, I want insurance on this, and I'm going to pay you a fee. It's going to be less than what I've made initially out of the sale of this bond, but I'm going to take all of this loss that I can possibly get and that I expect to get, and I'm going to offload it onto you, AIG. So they bet against themselves, which to me, nothing proves intent more clearly than that. You knew there because the mortgages would never get paid back. And so what you did is you took what you could in the beginning, and then you offloaded the risk with a credit default swap. And so what you then get is that when it does fall apart, AIG had written more insurance policies, if you will, on those loans than it could afford. So if AIG collapsed, then Goldman would be on the hook for it, and Goldman would then collapse. And it wouldn't just be Goldman Sachs, it would be Bank of America, it would be Ernst & Young, it would be all of these people are going to collapse. So we then had, what are you going to do to keep the financial system from destruction? So it is the Big Short. You see, all of it gets complicated though, and it becomes hard to follow. I think they do a really good job in The Big Short and in the movie, but even through that, it's still hard to follow. But it is a very good one. Yeah. Go ahead, Ralph, if you'll unmute.
Now I'm unmuted. Yay. Just a couple of thoughts here, kind of following along from what you were saying, and I'm certainly going to go watch that movie. One is, the government, I mentioned this on the last talk, the government stepped in and we had a large bailout. And we had a stimulus package. I don't guess it was stimulus, but whatever it called, it resulted in a huge government expenditure. So once again, this kitchen table budget idea for the United States is just the height of insanity and stupidity. Only the government could have stepped in and done what it did. But the other thing is, Sal, here we are and we're 10, 12 years post 2008 and 9. Do you think the government and the financial regulation side of things is any better set up today with this, that, they won't stop saying, well, a recession could be right around the corner. They just won't stop saying it. Every time something comes in, it's about the economy's resilient. People are doing better. The economy's resilient. We're surprised at the strength. On and on. Lowest economy, lowest unemployment in 50 years. But they just won't shut up about a recession around the corner. So is this one, are we any better situated for it? And will it be like previous ones? Because now, after 2008 and 9, what is a recession now in today's economy?
Well, there's a couple of things there. Let me say that you're right. Only the government could have come in to bail out the crash of 2008. The banking system was hanging by a thread. And the government didn't have the cash to simply send to the banks and pick them up. What they did was through quantitative easing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, quantitative easing means we printed more money.
Right.
I mean, and that's it. and I mean, that is what they did. And you know, it's interesting how they don't use that term. They have a really neat quantitative easing of the fourth quarter. You know, people go, well, I don't even know what that. Whoa, okay, great. Well, it meant we just printed more money, and we forced the banks to take the money. It wasn't like, would you like to buy? No, you must take it. And then you had regulation that came out of that, which said to the banks and others, you must have this much money in reserve. So you can't lend out all your money. So if something goes bust, you know, the whole economy comes down with it. So they forced them to do that. And then they put them through tests where they ran scenarios of a crash to see if these different banks would survive and that kind of thing.
Okay.
Now, what happens though, is you have changes of administration. Those laws have been weakened. We may be teetering on doing the same nonsense all over again. So, you know, you know, I go back to, you got to know what you're really fighting.
Mm-hmm.
Or what happens is you have this fight with the slave masters from the Civil War that's ongoing. You have 2008 occurs and it becomes a wound, an injury. So what you do is you patch the wound, you go in the hospital, you get healed. But the force that injured you, it has not been stopped at all. And so, you know, follow it up with what happens on January 6th.
Mm-hmm.
All of it is connected.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of what I want to communicate through this class is, don't think it's just one event. These things, you got to know as Sun Tzu said, know your enemy and know yourself. And I don't believe we know our enemy.
No, and it's ironic that these same people that tell me, well, we should run the government like a business. Hey, if they were paying attention, they would see that the banks have a cash reserve, did before regulation, but it wasn't big enough. Now it's bigger. So the government of the United States would be well served to have the ability to move large amounts of money, not necessarily have to print it. If we had a decent and fair tax system, which we do not, we could actually have revenue for the government to hold in reserve. There are governments on this planet that have large capital reserves, Norway being the prime example. Now they've made that off the oil industry, but the fact remains, that's another area where the United States simply doesn't do what the rest of the world does. Our natural resources are not taxed. It's the mining law dates from 1872. It's unchanged. I know about that one because of environmental work. The United States is due much more royalties than it gets. It's absurd. But it's ironic, isn't it? Because, you know, they want to run like your family checkbook over the counter. They don't want the government to have that money. And so there's seems to be no appetite right now for doing anything significant with the tax system, even though it's blatantly unfair and everyone knows it. But you can't, nobody's talking.
If you really look at the heart of the recession at this point, you have to go to the tax cut of, what was it, 2017, 18, whatever it was that.
17, I think.
That amount of money, compare it with the amount of money that the Biden administration spent for, COVID and infrastructure and all of that. They don't equal. If you had those taxes coming in, we would have easily been able to afford the expenses that came. But away from the ideological side of that is that when Hamilton forms the national bank, it is formed as really a depository for taking in tax money and paying off debts. I mean, that's what they're essentially doing. And then we have Adam Smith, who says, you ought to be taking in money and paying off debts, but government should also be providing the infrastructure, things that businesses couldn't afford, like an interstate, system or whatever, canals, bridges, all that would facilitate commerce.
Right. Most people don't know that about Adam Smith. They don't know that. They don't know that he says in the book quite explicitly that government must be the resolver of these things, must do the level playing field, must stop cheating and fraud. I mean,
right. I mean, I know the people who are the proponents of Adam Smith, I wish they would read it. It's almost, it's kind of like people who I hear are, religious zealots who have never read the text. It's like talking about how the slave masters had their people out there saying, Jesus never said you should called for selflessness. What? Where did that come from? But you see, it's all of that if you actually read what's there, it's a whole different story.
Gotcha.
Thanks. Madeline, you asked which I didn't catch your message right away on the post. You want to know when was that testimony?
That was the Brooks, the first one, the very first one with what's her name?
With Brooksley Born?
Yeah, Brooksley Born.
Yeah, that was before 1998.
Okay. Well,
and then it follows 98 then follows, and that's when the .com crash took place.
Right.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to make a little comment just for fun while you were talking. I forgot the fourth guy in that working group, but Alan Greenspan is worth $20 million. Larry Summers is worth $45 million. And Robert Rubin is worth $100 million. And perhaps we shouldn't be taking our advice only from these super rich people who have no clue about the bottom 99+%. Just a thought.
Well, they do in their defense is that they have somebody working for them who will walk a street every now and then and look at common people and come in and tell them about it. No.
Anyway,
no,
that's all I have to say. But I just thought that was who was the fourth guy?
Oh, Levitt, Arthur Levitt from Securities Exchange.
Okay.
And no, I mean, really, there is a great disparity, but the notion that you can simply let the market rule, no guardrails at all.
That doesn't work for anything, let alone
it's absurd.
Our finance system. It doesn't work for anything.
And if we go back to 1945. Had anybody said that, they would simply be out on a fringe someplace and ignored.
Yeah.
Today, you had the top 3 people with the most power over finance who all subscribe to that thought. And I'm arguing that comes from the people who were the slave masters who continued to want to get back to power, and this was their mechanism.
Thanks. I've got
Good
to-
point. Good point, Madeline.
So,
Thank you.
Sal,
Okay.
can you tell us a little bit about next week?
Well, next week, we're going to, we have all of this, to me, what is obvious fraud. The question then is, why was nobody prosecuted? And we're going to look at that next week.
Great.
And again, it's not going to be uplifting, but that's what it is. Okay, everybody. Well, thank you for coming.
Yeah,
I hope you're getting something from this. Thank you.
Everybody, you can unmute yourselves and give.
Thank you.
Thank
you, Sal.
Everyone.
And thank him for just.
Thank you, Sal.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sal.
Thank you.